Are you filming me? All right. If you would, take a seat. We're going to come to Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. This will be the sequel to what you heard yesterday. Cosmic Versailles, Cosmic Tribute, and Cosmic War. UFOs, human power systems, space rearmament, and the decision to assert human independence. Give a warm welcome to Dr. Joseph P. Farrell.
All right. You get to hear me again. All right, let me get the commercial out of the way here. Always have to do my commercial. What I'm doing, as I said yesterday, is kind of a distillation of remarks I've made, kind of interlarded in different books and different interviews. The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics and Ancient Texts, Babylon's Banksters, the Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance and Ancient Religion, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, kind of an overlooked book in this whole idea, but it's an important one, The Surviving Elites of the Cosmic War and Their Hidden Agenda. Grid of the Gods, Aftermath of the Cosmic War and the Physics of the Pyramid Peoples, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, The Secret Program, Celestial Psyops and Hidden Conflicts, Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations, UFOs, Oligarchs, and Space Secrecy, and then, of course, several interviews on different radio shows and comments over the years. So I'm trying to distill some of these remarks and make my process of reasoning for having made those remarks much clearer. Now, today, I'm going to be concentrating once again on three basic points: the interference of UFOs with human communications systems, particularly in this talk. Previously, I've been emphasizing UFO interference with defense systems and with UFO interference of nuclear weapons systems, and particularly thermonuclear weapons systems. In last year's conference, I mentioned that rather frightening incident where there was a UFO over Soviet ICBM silos in Bielogorodice in the Ukraine. And please, it's the Ukraine, it's not Ukraine. In Bielogorodice in the Ukraine, that actually began the launch sequence countdown. And of course, the Soviet crews were frantically trying to shut this down to prevent a global thermonuclear war. The second point we're going to be talking about is an all too brief look at all of the quantitative easing and missing money, as Catherine just mentioned in her talk previously. And I want to say something about that. When Yaron contacted all of us to give us an opportunity to come to this conference, he kind of suggests topics, but none of us coordinate with each other. And I've been always amazed at these conferences with the synchronicity of insight that people have. I'll be talking about some things that Olaf has already mentioned in his talk, and I can assure you, there was no coordination on it. But we're going to be talking about some of the quantitative easing and missing money that are in the financial systems, the mutilations that Linda Moulton Howe has studied and brought to our attention over the years, and some other mysteries and things that, in my opinion, like the big question mark section on Catherine's pie graph with the question marks, these to me suggest that we might be looking at that Versailles template that I outlined for you yesterday. So as I'm going through these three major points of my talk, and the final point especially, the disturbing scenario, what I want you to keep in the back of your head and in your minds is the context of this Versailles template. So let's start with a look back in history at one of the early alternative researchers into strange phenomena, a fellow that if you don't know him, become acquainted with him. a fellow by the name of Charles Fort. And this is a rather lengthy quotation that I want to read to you, but it sets the stage for my final remarks. This is sort of part two to the remarks that I made yesterday. It sort of sets the stage for you to what's to follow in this talk. I want you to keep in mind that Versailles context, that Versailles template that I indicated that members of the American national security establishment may have been operating with after World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War, because many of them were very influential and formative policymakers during the Versailles Conference itself and then in the aftermath of the adjustments that were made to it in the interwar period. Quote, "In this summer of 1923, now let's stop and remember something. Remember yesterday I said that the French in 1923 exercised their rights under the Versailles Treaty to occupy the Ruhr Valley in Germany and compel German reparations. So this is a very crucial year in the interwar period. In this summer of 1923, French aviators told of inexplicable mishaps and forced landings while flying over German territory. The instances were so frequent that there arose a belief that with secret raids the Germans were practicing upon French airplanes. From a general impression of an existence of rationality and irrationality, we can conceive that the Germans were practicing upon French airplanes something that they were most particularly endeavoring to keep secret from France, if they had such powers. But I think that they had not, or that officially they had not. There may have been a hidden experimenter. Think of what Walter Bosley showed you yesterday. That there may have been a hidden experimenter unknown to the German authorities. An article upon this subject was published in the London Daily Mail, September 1st, 1923. Quote, "Two theories have been put forward. One is that by a concentration of wireless rays, the magneto of the airplane may be affected. Another is that a new ray, which will melt certain metals, has been discovered. In this connection, it is notable that most of the forced landings of the French airplanes when flying from Strasbourg to Prague have taken place in the vicinity of a German aerodrome near Furt. It was said that for some time, at the German wireless station at Nauen, there had been experiments upon directional wireless with the object of sending out rays, concentrated along a certain path, as the beams of a searchlight are directed. The authorities at Nauen denied that they had any knowledge of anything that could have affected the French airplanes in ways that were reported or exposed. The forced landings of French airplanes in the summer of 1923 remain unexplained," unquote, unquote. And incidentally, they remain unexplained to this day. But now if you look at what Charles Fort implied back there in the interwar period, he's once again implying the existence of some secretive program experimenting on technology. We don't know who. Was it German? Was it not? He implies, first of all, the occurrence of an apparent electromagnetic interference with French flights over a concentrated specific region of Germany in 1923, and that suggests deliberate human agency. And secondly, that agency may be completely separate or independent of the official German government channels. We don't know. Remember what Walter said yesterday about the Nationalische Jagdflugzeug Maschinenzahlungsamt, okay, the National Aerial Flying Machine Payment Office, okay? So why is all of this relevant? Let's look back at San Mateo last year. And again, I said that there were UFOs. I was trying to review very quickly the thick volume research that a scholar of this particular subject, Mr. Robert Hastings, in a wonderful book called UFOs and Nukes, about a 500-page book. And he recounts in this several instances, one of them in my home state of South Dakota, as a matter of fact, taking down whole flights of ICBMs, both inside the United States and inside the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There were instances at Malmgren Air Force Base in Montana outside Great Falls. There were instances at the Air Force Base in Minot, North Dakota. There were incidents at Ellsworth Air Force Base just outside of Rapid City in my home state of South Dakota. And then, of course, we had that very famous and troubling incident at Bielokorovice. But interestingly enough, you'll recall something else that I pointed out last year. When the United States Air Force began to have these difficulties with UFOs turning on and off flights of ICBMs at Malmgren Air Force Base in Great Falls, Montana, and in some cases it's reported that the actual targeting data was altered. So imagine, we get into a shooting war with the Soviet Union and the ICBMs exit their silos and just fall right back down. This is not a thing you want to have happen. The interesting thing is that Mr. Hastings reports in his book that the U.S. Defense Corporation, Boeing, was called in by the United States Air Force to investigate these incidents and to find out what was going on. And Boeing was able to reduplicate some of those effects remotely. Now, as I put it up here on the slide, these abilities imply the ability to interfere with electrical systems of any nature. Now, put that in the context of what Secretary Fitz just talked about. Imagine the financial system subject to such interdiction. That includes the power grid, computerized algorithmic training, and so on and so forth. Now, while we're talking about that, I want to go back to the problem of 11/9, not 9/11, the problem of 11/9. Because if you were alive at the time, I was, on November 9th, 1965, at precisely 5:16 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, portions of Ontario from Toronto to Montreal, and the entirety of the states of New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. In other words, the entire American Northeast, and then the southern portion of Ontario on up into Quebec and Canada, were subject to a complete power blackout, including electrical systems on cars, trapping about 30 million people on expressways, in elevators, in the skyscrapers for hours. They even did a movie about this. I think Peter Lawford was in it. What were you doing in the Great Power Blackout? Now, there's a problem on 11/9. The Toronto Globe and Mail of November 16th, 1965 reports what has become more or less since this incident the official story, and we're used now, in today's age, of having official realities, as Catherine pointed out, versus the actual reality. A substation, an electrical substation near Syracuse, New York's relay switch had failed to function properly and dampen overload in the electrical lines, and that triggered the blackout. That's the official story. The problem was that according to the same article, when repairmen checked it, the relay and the substation were in complete and perfect working order. The same Toronto Globe and Mail article of November 16th, 1965, after the blackout was over, also indicated that immediately prior to the blackout, and please follow me here. Immediately prior to the blackout, the power surge flowed from a Canadian substation to New York via Cornwall, then down to New York, and then back up to that Canadian electrical substation. Now, either Canada's declaring war on us, which I think is unlikely, but in graphical terms, what this means is that the power was flowing in a great big clockwise loop around the entirety of Lake Ontario. Now, I'll just toss that out there for all of you physics-inclined people to ponder what's going on here. Now, incidentally, this occurs in a very rare article, an investigation that was done by NICAP, the National Investigative Committee for the Investigation of Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. It was a UFO study group that was founded by, here it comes, Thomas Townsend Brown. No longer extant. And you can research this article. The URL is http://www.mt.net/tilde, then the word watcher, /FONOV1965, power outage, all one word. It's a very rare article, worth reading. And as this article points out, in the Syracuse Herald Journal of November 13th, 1965, in the Niagara Gazette of April 2nd, 1968, in the New York Herald Journal of the 15th of November, 1965, and the Syracuse Herald American on November 14th of 1965, all reported UFO activity prior to and or during this blackout. And here's the clincher. The Syracuse Herald Journal and the Niagara Gazette articles reported these UFO activities over electrical substations or power lines. Now, if true, and I happen to think that they are, that these reports are entirely true, there's too many of them coincidental with the blackout. If true, this means that whoever or whatever technology is at work in UFOs has the capability to interdict human power systems at that day. So this was a problem for the national security establishment, and it wouldn't go away. So in 1968, in front of the House Investigative Committee on Science in July, Dr. James McDonald, and those of you who are familiar with the field of ufology will recognize that name instantly. This was a professor, I believe, of astronomy at the University of Arizona, who, like Professor J. Allen Hynek in Ohio, became part of the country's expertise pool, public expertise pool, that it drew upon to discuss the subject of UFOs. Listen to the following exchange very carefully between Congressman Ryan and Dr. McDonald. Congressman Ryan, let me ask you a further question. In the course of your investigation and your study of UFO sightings, have you found any cases where contemporaneously with the sightings of UFOs allegedly, there were any other events which took place which might or might not be related to the UFOs? Dr. McDonald. Yes, there were certainly many physical effects. Even the famous one, the New York blackout, involved UFO sightings. Dr. Hynek probably would be the most appropriate man to describe the Manhattan sighting since he interviewed several witnesses involved. I interviewed a woman in Seacliff, New York. She saw a disc hovering and going up and down, and then shooting away from New York just after the power failure. I went to the Federal Power Commission for data. They didn't take them seriously, although they had dozens of sighting reports for that famous evening. It is rather puzzling that the pulse of current that tripped the relay at the Ontario Hydro Commission plant has never been identified. But initially, the tentative suspicion was centered on the clay substation of the Niagara-Mohawk network right there in the Syracuse area, where unidentified aerial phenomena has been seen by some of the witnesses. This is a disturbing series of coincidences that I think warrant much more attention than they have so far achieved, unquote. Now, before we leave this, let's talk about another famous incident. Because if you're not familiar with a researcher back in the 80s and 90s by the name of John Keel, he added a little bit of extra information. He says, quote, during the Great Northeastern Blackout of 1965, several local power companies completely independent of the affected main power grid also failed. Interestingly, while normal AM radio frequencies, and here's a little physics detail for you folks, while normal AM radio frequencies continued to operate that night, shortwave and very low frequency transmission and reception in the affected regions were hopelessly jammed with static. Now, let me stop you there. At this time in American history, the US Navy is using very low frequency and ultra low frequency radio transmission with the antennas actually physically buried in the earth to communicate with our nuclear submarine fleet. So in other words, this is, by dint of this admission alone, a national security issue. This alone indicates an extraordinary electromagnetic condition existed. Following the blackout, New York's Con Edison Power Company quietly installed expensive magnetic shielding devices around key equipment, and new heavy shielded cables were introduced in sensitive areas. After 1965, Bell Telephone Company began switching from overhead lines, remember when that happened, to more expensive, heavily shielded cables buried under the ground, unquote. And you'll find that reference in John Keel's probably most famous work, Our Haunted Planet. That's a Galdi Press publication from Lakeville, Minnesota. That's on page 178. Now, please note what this implies. Number one, these actions on the part of these very large, very powerful, at that time very blue chip corporations indicate that the official story isn't true. They know something. And that the 11/9 blackout had a deliberate technological cause. But most importantly, what they indicate is a private corporate interest in the study of the UFO phenomenon for the very practical purpose of shielding communications and the nation's defense and communications grid. Now, Keel goes on to reveal something else, which I want you to bear this in mind in the light of the events of May 6, 2010. Remember the so-called flash crash, where the stock market within a matter of seconds plunged, and you heard the frantic announcers thinking this is the apocalypse, and then, just as inexplicably, it came right back up. Listen to what Keel had to say. Quote, in the summer of 1970, all the electronic gear in the videotape studios of Waddell and Reed Incorporated in Kansas City, Missouri went haywire. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because during the flash crash of May 6, 2010, the official story is that the flash crash began with trades placed by Waddell and Reed in Kansas City. But in 1970, the same problem was dealt with by Waddell and Reed in the following way. Something made our equipment completely sensitive to everything around us. The manager of the studio, Mrs. Kevin Eisenbrandt, told the Kansas City Star on August 5, 1970. The nearby Commerce Bank experienced similar problems with their computers and electronic gear at the same time. Experts called in to investigate were baffled, unquote. Now, let's look what we have so far. Number one, the concurrence of UFO activity during the Great Blackout of 1965 and the subsequent decision by power companies and Bell Laboratories suggests or implies that the UFO problem was known to the corporate world. So what I'm telling you is whether or not you think that there is government study of UFOs, there sure is corporate study of UFOs. And that corporate world was taking direct, immediate, and practical action to secure the power grid and communications systems against the threat. And that suggests that there's going to be a strong degree of corporate influence over any government study and response to the UFO phenomenon. And remember, all of this within the template and context of the Versailles model. I haven't forgotten that. We're getting back there. Number two, the placement of magnetic shielding over some power stations and cables suggests that they have an insight, or at least a partial insight, into the nature of the technology of the phenomenon itself and its reliance upon or production of strong magnetic fields as the result of its propulsion systems. Thirdly, the presence of UFO activity and interdiction or interference with human weapons and power systems and the implied ability to interfere with any computer-based system, including our most hardened, most secure systems in our ICBM sites and our thermonuclear weapons sites, implies the ability that not only defensive measures must be taken, but that actions are, in the human understanding, please hear me, an act of war requiring a response. There's your Versailles template. Number four, as Fort pointed out, and as we indicated with respect to Boeing's reproduction of some of the effects of these UFO interdictions and interferences with flights of ICBMs, some aspects of the phenomenon are clearly indicating some possible, though secret, human agency may conceivably be behind the phenomenon. So now let's look at something else. Again, we didn't coordinate any of this, but Secretary Fitz just reminded you of Secretary Rumsfeld's admission at the Pentagon on the camera that some $2.2 trillion was missing from the federal budget. $9 trillion admitted missing by the Federal Reserve Inspector, Elizabeth Coleman, in 2013. And let's look at something else. Secretary Fitz mentioned the fear porn that she has to deal with in the financial industry, in the financial analysis that's being done that, oh, the dollar's going to collapse any minute now. Folks, I'm old enough to remember when Nixon took us off Bretton Woods, and there was almost instant panic and crisis. We're going to have hyperinflation any minute now, and the world's going to end. And these predictions of economic and financial collapse have been recurring for one way, by one means or another since then. It's like predicting the rapture. Every 5 years we have a new rapture prediction. We have hyperinflation predictions. We have deflation predictions. And we've had it since then. And as Catherine said, as long as you are dealing with a closed system financial model and not looking at this hidden system of finance, the black budgets, and what all of this hidden money is going through and for, you have at best 50% of the picture, and you are not, therefore, going to be able to make an accurate financial prediction. There is a, if I can put it in electrical circuit terms, there's a hidden load end to the system. And that is explainable as funding for black projects and possibly off-world activities and or the payment of a tribute or a tithe or a reparation. And as Linda Moulton Howe has pointed out several times in her work on mutilations, the mutilations themselves have some signs or indications, including the process of exsanguination, of an ongoing operation of sacrifice. Let's remember, read your Old Testament. Exsanguination is part of the procedure of an animal sacrifice. You drain the blood. So, let's get back to our Versailles template for a moment. Reparations, as I suggested yesterday, war reparations are really the modern term for a tribute or a tithe, and this is the way of harvesting the wealth of a vanquished and tributary population. Now, in our Versailles template, I want you to note two things. France used a significant component of the reparations that they were receiving from Germany to build the Maginot Line, that big defensive system of underground fortifications that stretched all the way from Alsace-Lorraine up around Metz, all the way down to Mulhouse and Belfort towards the Swiss border, a long, long line, defensive line of fortifications. And Germany paid those reparations, as I pointed out yesterday, up to a point, while simultaneously, long before Hitler, secretly rearming by negotiating treaties with the other pariah nations of the day, and particularly the Soviet Union, and rearming Germany outside of sovereign German territory. And this was done largely by the new emerging sovereignties in the early 20th century of the international corporations, in this case, the big German cartels. The third thing you'll recall that the Germans did is inside of Germany they built what? Vast underground installations. And we have the idea historically in our heads that, well, this is really only a process that begins under Hitler and the Nazis. Not so. This has actually begun as early as the early 1920s by the Weimar Republic. It's the Weimar Republic, not Hitler, that sets Germany on the path to rearmament and building these vast underground installations that the Nazis will use during World War II. Some of them are built by the Nazis, of course. Now, I want to leave you with another consideration before we proceed on. Remember that Versailles template, because what happens if you get fed up with following the provisions of a very stiff treaty? You break it. You revolt. So, remember the Spartacus revolt of the slaves in the Roman Empire. They even made a movie out of it. Kirk Douglas, Laurence Olivier. We have finally the ancient, largely Mesopotamian tradition indicative of an ancient genetic engineering possibility for the origins of man. And this component, remember what I suggested yesterday, you've got the national security establishment, that's a literate group of people. And in my opinion, they're going to start going back and investigating these historical precedents as a possible thing that they have to consider as they're formulating their policy for the future, and in particular, with respect to the UFO phenomenon. This means that this heightens that sense that they're in a Tower of Babel moment of history once again. Now, as I wrote, there's a problem if this chimerical genetic engineering story of the origins of man are true. And I wrote this in my book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. Listen carefully, because it's a question of law. And remember what Catherine said? You cannot have a functioning economy without a basis in law. This whole idea of the ancient genetic engineering of man places the story of the creation of man into an interesting light, because if it's true, then under the standards of American patent law, which are more or less the same as most Western nations, the human being as a hybrid creature would apparently fulfill all 4 requirements for a patent. As such, human beings as chimerical hybrids of other species are, number 1, original, that's one of the 4 requirements. Number 2, non-obvious, for they are not the obvious products of nature, but of the hand of man. In other words, the hand of intelligence, consciousness. Number 3, they were created, according to the ancient text, for a demonstrable function. They were to be slaves of the gods. And number 4, they were the result of a process of genetic engineering that, if you're going to engineer something genetically, it's a reproducible process. So, these questions compel some speculative questions of their own. For if mankind, as currently constituted, is a chimerical creature and the product of such genetic engineering, and moreover, was created for the express purpose of being a slave to the gods, then who owns him? So the question is, as Catherine suggested, not just who owns Earth, but who owns us, if anybody. And let's speculate further to see how the law would look at this question. If mankind's original owner-creators were suddenly to return right now, ever wonder why all the predictions of disclosure aren't happening? Might this have something to do with it? If they were to return right now to planet Earth, would they have a legal claim? And would, moreover, they be able to prove it? Let me continue. And what court would have the jurisdiction to hear that case? What did Versailles do? Well, set up the League of Nations. What else did it do? It set up the International Court. That's part of the Versailles template. What court would have the jurisdiction to hear a case like that? And additionally, you're facing 2 legal claims. Number 1, that of the returning owner-creators. And number 2, this is an important one, that of the course of performance of humanity since their departure, because we've been, we think, more or less on our own. So there's actually a precedent established now in the performance of this contract, of this Versailles template, of this treaty, if there ever was one. There's a course of performance indicating that we've more or less managed our own affairs. And that means we're self-governing. So we would be, so to speak, abandoned property and under new ownership, namely of ourselves. Okay? Now, I'm sorry, folks, questions afterwards, please. These considerations lead to the next set of data points that we have to consider as we're looking at this Versailles template model, and Catherine's again brought up some of them. Look at, number one, the expansion, not just of the phenomenon of additive manufacturing, or 3D printing as it's popularly known. Look at the expansion of the talk about it in the last 2 to 3 years. Think of what 3D printing allows you to do. It allows you to prototype locally. Want to build a widget that you need for a fuss budget? Well, you can prototype that right there in your home, cheaply. It allows you to do something else, and please note what I put up here. It allows you to disperse manufacturing. The days of the big industrial plants of Stoke-on-Trent and Essen, Germany, and Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and Detroit are over. Because you can manufacture, quite literally, you can manufacture some of these parts in a very small manufacturing plant, assemble them somewhere else. You have a distributed manufacturing base and potentially a precision distributing manufactured base. And why do I put the military parallel? Well, most of you know that we're bombing the daylights out of Nazi Germany during World War II, and the height of that bombing occurs in August of 1944. Interestingly enough, the height of German war production in all categories, tanks, aircraft, submarines, vehicles of all sorts, also peaks in August of 1944. I think at one point I saw a statistic where in that month alone, Germany had produced over 30,000 aircraft. You know, we have the idea that, you know, it's the United States big industrial machine crushing poor little Germany. 30,000 aircraft in a month. The problem, of course, was they didn't have the pilots. But the industrial production was chugging along just fine. The reason why is a fellow by the name of Albert Speer, who moved all of that production underground and dispersed the manufacturing base, and they did modular manufacturing. They were building submarines inland and welding them together right at the docks. Now, magnify that, put that on steroids, and you've got 3D printing. So in other words, it also looks to me like 3D printing is dispersing the manufacturing base so that you're dispersing targets. Why are they so afraid? The next problem you have is the American global gulag of so-called rendition camps. I prefer the term torture camps. Because we have to ask ourselves, are there really that many terrorists in the world? Or is that just the cover story for something else that, like Olaf suggested earlier, is to gather labor, especially labor that we in the West wouldn't particularly care one way or the other if we were missing, to go somewhere else and help build something else along the line of alternative threes batch consignments. So what do we have? We have a simple equation, and I put it up here. You have the Versailles template with all of its implications: reparations, quarantine, covert rearmament, plus demonstrated UFO interference and interdiction with human military, economic, and communications and electrical power grid systems, plus the push of additive distributive manufacturing and disappearing money in the trillions of dollars, plus a global gulag of rendition camps equals what? So let me leave you with a few remarks to ponder from now until the next conference. These are again from Charles Fort. I think we're property. I should say we belong to something. That once upon a time this earth was no man's land, that other worlds explored and colonized here, or maybe vice versa, and fought among themselves for possession, but that now it's owned by something, that something owns this earth, all others warned off. I suspect that after all, we're useful, that something among contesting claimants, adjustment has occurred. Adjustment. What kind of adjustment has occurred? Let me stop and give you a hint. Because using this Versailles model, there were adjustments to the treaty, beginning after that disastrous French occupation of the Ruhr in 1923. The provisions were renegotiated under the Young and Dawes plans. And then finally, in 1930, just before Hitler takes power, everybody agreed no more reparations. That adjustment has occurred. Or that something now has a legal right to us by force or by having paid out analogs of beads for us to former, more primitive owners of us, all others warned off, that all this has been known, perhaps for ages, to certain ones upon this earth, a cult or order, members of which function like bellwethers to the rest of us, or as superior slaves or overseers, directing us in accordance with instructions received from somewhere else in our mysterious usefulness, unquote. And that's Charles Fort from the Book of the Damned, page 163. And those remarks bring us to what I call the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd. Because I told you yesterday and earlier today that many of the most influential members of the American national security establishment had their policy and cultural worldview formed, not just by World War II and not just by the Cold War, but when these were young men acting as staffers for other older, more powerful men, they were doing it in World War I and in its aftermath at Versailles. And one of them was Allen Dulles of Sullivan and Cromwell, who with his brother, later John Foster Dulles, later the Secretary of State, these were members of President Wilson's staff at Versailles, figuring out and advising Wilson on how we're going to handle die Deutsche Problem. Yeah? He ends up, of course, as an OSS station chief at Zurich, Switzerland during World War II, and then later director of the CIA, and then later fired by President Kennedy, and then later, of course, on the Warren Commission. But the formative years of this man's worldview for government and international relations were forged in the crucible of Versailles. One of his subordinates is this man here, Richard M. Bissell. I talked a great deal about him at last year's Secret Space Program Conference. Who's this guy? Well, he happens to be running the U-2 program. This is the guy who's Oswald's boss over in Atsugi, Japan, at the Air Force Base, where Oswald is a radar operator tracking U-2 flights over the Soviet Union. He's also in charge of all of the Central Intelligence Agency's covert operations in the 50s and 60s, and that would mean, incidentally, the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, the overthrow of the Guatemalan government, the Bay of Pigs, you name it. He's also the man in charge of developing the early American spy satellite program, and he's a close associate of Nelson Rockefeller. Here's two more for you. George F. Kennan cannot emphasize the importance of this man, because as one of President Truman's post-World War II national security advisors, this is the man that drafts National Security Council Resolution number 48, which basically and for the first time states the policy of containment and slow rollback of the communist bloc with appropriate supporting covert operations along the way, basically without going to the war as we had, please hear me now, without going to war as the Western Allies and eventually the United States had to do against Imperial Germany and lay siege to it for 4 years. We were going to do the same thing without an active hot war. It's the policy of containment. This is its author. This is the man who basically accepts the idea that American intelligence got in bed with General Reinhard Gehlen at the end of World War II. Guess where he studied international relations, law, and geopolitics between the wars? Guess where his outlook was formed? The University of Berlin. This man over here is John J. McCloy, another Sullivan and Cromwell crowd member. Again, a highly placed national security advisor. He's like a revolving door in the post-war years. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. In 1936, he shares a box at the 1936 Berlin Olympics with Adolf Hitler. He is the American lawyer for the American branches of I.G. Farben. After World War II, he is the American High Commissioner for Germany. And it's this man, therefore, that is responsible for pardoning over 70,000 Nazis in Western Germany. If you've read my book, The Third Way, the anonymous contacts mentioned in the Madrid circular probably go all the way up to that man. And he sat on the Warren Commission. So, on the 33rd and final slide, I'm going to leave you with some thoughts. I think that all of this cultural context is necessary because I think that these men took the decision that whatever they were dealing with the UFO phenomenon, that it was absolutely necessary to do two things. Number one, humanity had to avoid absolutely any recurrence of a Tower of Babel moment in human history where any force external to humanity stepped in and dictated what the human future should be. Or to put it in the German terms that they would have known from the period, almost as soon as the ink was dry on the Treaty of Versailles, German political philosophers and lawyers and industrialists began talking about the necessity for Germany to reassert its Wehrhoheit, which means its military sovereignty. You cannot have sovereignty if you are left weak and defenseless, surrounded by powerful neighbors. I think this means, therefore, that they took a second decision, that humanity had to have the ability to assert and maintain its sovereignty and independence against whoever was out there. And it's that process of reasoning that leads them to conclude that we have to develop hidden technologies, which is going to cost a lot of money over several decades, to develop the systems to establish parity or near parity that can emulate the performance characteristics of UFOs. So ask yourself the following series of questions, and this is how I'm going to leave it with you. I'm going to pose questions for you. Number one, would such men surrender? Or would they insist on immediate public disclosure? Or would they adhere to whatever treaty provisions that they may have discovered in their researches while secretly rearming? And three final questions to ponder. If there was, at some point in high antiquity, a cosmic Versailles between whomever and planet Earth, when did or does that treaty expire? Or did it expire? Or did one party serve notice to the other party that it was withdrawing from the provisions of the treaty? And that's it. Thank you.